Despite the machoism and hypermasculinity often attributed to the politics of Black nationalism, Black nationalist women have always organized within Black nationalist movements and contributed ideological developments central to sharpening the analysis of Black nationalists. This is the case for New African women who have organized and continue to organize in the New African Independence Movement. The New African Independence Movement was propelled in 1968 with the founding of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa in Detroit. From March 30th to the 31st of 1968, around 500 Black organizers from across the United States convened to discuss the creation of a separate and sovereign nation in the U.S. South. Edward Onichi highlights in his book, Free the Land, the Republic of New Africa, and the Pursuit of a Black Nation State, that it is both Malcolm X and Queen Mother Audley Moore who inspired the founders of the PGRNA to formalize plans for an independent Black nation. The central document produced from the founding convention was the New African Declaration of Independence, which Queen Mother Audley Moore is reported to have been the first to put her signature on. The Declaration pronounced New Africans' assertion of independence from the United States as it stated that they, quote, do hereby declare ourselves forever free and independent of the jurisdiction of the United States of America and the obligations which that country's unilateral decision to make our ancestors and ourselves paper citizens placed on us. Historian Ashley Farmer, in her article, Mothers of Pan-Africanism, Audley Moore and Dara Abubakari, highlights the Black nationalist and Pan-African organizing of New African women, Queen Mother Audley Moore and Dara Abubakari. Both women were instrumental to shaping the New African Independence Movement, as their organizing prior to the founding of the PGRNA established them as primary theoreticians and mentors for the New African Independence Movement. Both women were members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Moore was a prominent organizer for the Communist Party in Harlem, and both women organized in the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, an organization Queen Mother Audley Moore founded in 1957. The Universal Association of Ethiopian Women engaged in domestic organizing such as advocating for Black men falsely charged of raping white women, and they also organized against laws that would reduce the amount of Black women that received welfare. The Universal Association of Ethiopian Women maintained a Pan-African analysis, and in the early 1960s, quote, the two women shifted the focus of the organization to acquiring reparations and developing an autonomous Black nation. Farmer demonstrates that Moore and Abubakari advocated for these nation-building aims prior to the establishment of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa in 1968, who later adopted these same goals as the main objectives of the New African Independence Movement. To assure equality of rights for the sexes was one of the 13 aims of the revolution outlined in the New African Declaration of Independence, created at the 1968 Black Government Convention in Detroit. In contrast to renowned Black power organizations such as the Black Panther Party and SNCC, at its founding, the PGRNA stated its intention to attack gender inequality. Yet this certainly does not mean the PGRNA or organizations within the New African Independence Movement were less likely to be sexist or patriarchal. Instead, just like the women in the Black Panther Party and SNCC, New African women had to push their New African brothers and sisters to include fighting sexism amongst their understanding of the larger fight against colonialism and imperialism. In her essay on the question of sexism within the Black Panther Party, New African Sophia Bukhari discussed sexism within the Black Panther Party and asserted that a multifaceted assault against women's oppression, colonialism, and imperialism must be waged for the liberation of all in the Black nation. Bukhari rejected a sensationalist interpretation of the Black Panther Party as uniquely sexist, and instead reminds readers that sexism within the party was a reflection of widespread patriarchal norms within American society. Bukhari states, quote, the members of the party were products of the society in which they lived. We struggled against those tendencies whenever possible, but they were reinforced by the larger society. Sophia Bukhari also challenged feminist conceptions of men as the primary antagonist of women's liberation, as she stated, quote, I am not a feminist. I am a revolutionary. I am a scientific socialist. Bukhari was certainly not against including the struggle against gender depression into the lexicon of what must be struggled against for the liberation of the Black nation, as she argued, quote, While the primary struggle the Black community faces is against racist oppression and economic exploitation, we must still deal with the problem of male chauvinism and sexism along with domestic violence in our communities. Significantly, Bukhari did not insist on subordination of any issue, contrary to some predominantly white feminists' critique of patriarchy, which never expanded beyond wanting to become equal with men within the capitalist economy. Bukhari argued the necessity of a multi-pronged assault on gender oppression, capitalism, and imperialism as she understood them as entwined impediments to the establishment of a Black nation. Considering the need to organize New African women to further the struggle for a Black nation and address the issues women were specifically facing, New African women decided to form the New African Women's Organization in 1980. The New African Women's Organization positioned women at the forefront of political organizing instead of in the background as only caretakers of children, their home, or their partners. In an essay written by women in the New African Women's Organization titled Liberation Through Participation, the unnamed authors highlight the organizing of women in Algeria, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe who were, quote, fighting alongside her male comrade to liberate her people from colonial oppression, and at the same time fighting to break the old chauvinist chains that hampered their growth and development. The authors positioned New African women in the same struggle as their African sisters as they asserted, quote, we must understand, as in other colonized countries, that when we speak of liberation, we speak of the total liberation of our people against racism, colonialism, and capitalism. Both men and women are exploited in the colonized New African nation, and most of the reactionary and backward attitudes perpetuated by brothers and sisters against one another is a result of hundreds of years of enslavement and colonization by our common oppressor. It is against this common oppressor, racism, and colonialism that we as women must direct our energies, and through our participation, we will begin to change our attitudes towards each other. New African women, including Safia Bukhari, Fulani Suni Ali, Nahand Abiodun, and Chinganji Akinyela, were members of the New African Women's Organization. In my interview with Chinganji Akinyela, she discussed the politics of the New African Independence Movement, including their ideas on nationhood and internationalism, the New African Women's Organization, debates amongst New African women and New African men about the utility of New African women organizing amongst themselves, and the contemporary organizing of New Africans in the Malcolm X grassroots movement. I have the immense privilege and honor to interview Chinganji Akinyela, who is a New African Independence Movement organizer. She is a co-founder of the New African Women's Organization, founded in 1980, a co-founder of the New African People's Organization, founded in 1984, and a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement and the New African Women's Task Force. And today I'm going to be interviewing her about the work she has done and continues to do as a New African organizer. So, Chinganji, if you could please talk about when and how you became active in the Black Liberation Movement, and also specifically how you became a part of the New African Independence Movement.
Yeah, certainly. I do want to preface my remarks to say that I've been on a little bit of a hiatus from the organized work because I decided after so many years to go back and try and get my college thing together. And okay, so it's been a long time, so it has been a little bit all-consuming to me. So I've had to take like a step back just in terms of the day-to-day work, but certainly not support of the work or the politics. But saying all that, having said that, as they say, I actually became acquainted with the idea of New African independence and the claim for the 5 states and the Black Belt, and claiming that New Africans were a nation. In my early organizing efforts around police abuse and support for police victims, abuse, those kinds of things in the Valley in California. So, I was involved with several organizing campaigns around 2 young brothers that had been killed in the area where I grew up in San Fernando. And at that time, there were quite a few cases that had become public. I'm not going to say they were new; they weren't new, but they became public, and and people began to rally around them. And so there were several different support groups, solidarity groups, that kind of thing, throughout the city of Los Angeles. And so we connected. They could. I'm not exactly how it actually came to fruition, but it actually did connect to. A lot of different organizations. I think that what happened was that there was something that was going before the in LA County, and so the organizations just came together and formed a coalition, and it was called the Coalition Against Police Abuse. So my organization was a community organization. It was not about New African Independence, even though our work was in the African community, African and Latinx community at that time. But in that process of organizing and working together with different groupings that were doing different types of work throughout the city, I became involved or became knowledgeable about the New African Independence movement, and began to look at it, began to study it. And so the offshoot of that was leaving after still being involved in the coalition work, becoming involved with the Center for Black Survival, the National Black Human Rights Campaign, began to go to some of the meetings and just began to study and look at the politics of nation building, let's say, New African nation building. And so from that point, I was invited to join the organization, which at the time was the African People's Party. And the African People's Party was like kind of, I think you mentioned in your report, it was kind of a bit of an offshoot or an extension of the Revolutionary Action Movement. Muhammad Ahmed was one of the primary members involved in the African People's Party. And so we formed a chapter of the African People's Party in Los Angeles and began to do work very similar to the work that I had already been doing around police abuse, but other things extended to other areas of concern in the community. And it also extended nationally and internationally. So that was my initial foray into it. And as I said, as I began to study and work with the people who had done that kind of work for a number of years, I began to believe and agree that that was the best step forward for our liberation as African people.
Thank you so much. And this is kind of going forward in terms of your political organizing, but I wanted to reference a 1989 essay you wrote titled "The Women Organizing Are Building to Win." And you declared the need to build a new African women's organization, as you stated, quote, "We must organize to fight the bourgeois tendency of Black feminism, women's liberation, and colored face. Our fight is not with new African men. Our fight is with imperialism and colonialism." So can you talk a bit more about your critique of Black feminism as you demonstrated within this quote?
Okay, first of all, I'm going to say, and I'm going to give you kudos. You went deep to find article because that article was a long, long time ago, and I was quite a bit younger. And I don't know that I have physical access to it. I could find it
I
online as well.
I can
But
send it to you because I found it through the Malcolm X Graphist Movement's newsletter.
paper,
You're right. So yeah, I
yeah,
will
I
send
think
it.
there was a hard copy of it, and we had even done something. We had done some, online stuff with it as well, just here recently,
Right.
just studying it. So let me say this: that at that point, um, of our beginning to look at the whole question of sexism and sexist oppression, we started with our own organization. And it was a debate, because these are, we have a lot of families, husbands and wives, and families that are involved in our organization. We always have. And we struggle together, we work together, we raise families together, right? So, the question of sexist oppression and sexism within our organization began to manifest itself in discussions. Not that it wasn't already there; it was there. But we began to be sensitive to it, to look at it, to see how it was manifesting itself in our work and what we were trying to do as an organization. And one of those issues, as a matter of fact, one of my comrades just spoke to this on Sunday, one of the issues was that it started with the issue of childcare, because within our organization we met, and quite a few times the sisters would not be able to participate in organizing the dialogue, the political conversations, what we're going to do, what our work was going to be, creating strategies and plans, because they either stayed home to deal with the children, or the children were at the actual place of the meeting, but not paying any attention to them. So they were running ragged. So that meant that most of the time a woman would be disposed to go and take care of them kids, those loud kids. And so we began to notice that because of that, there was an uneven development. We weren't getting this, that we might get the books and the readings to study. We meeting, we might, like I said, we might even be at the meeting, but we weren't able to participate fully because we were designated and considered we had to take care of those kids, right? So that was one of the things we raised firstly, that we weren't the only one produce these kids. So the brothers were going to have to take up some work, responsibilities, and so we began to and this was just like some really interesting stuff because we began to organize like a schedule on who would be in charge of the children, right? It's okay to bring the children to the meeting, because we did actually have, where we had our meeting there was a separate room for the children, but it should not always be us that would organize something for the children.
Right.
That our input, our knowledge, our struggle was just as important as theirs, right? That was a huge debate. And let me tell you what the debate was. Well, the brothers are way more advanced, and so it's more important that they be a part of these meetings. Really? So that was the beginning of the debate. And then, you have to keep in mind that at that time there wasn't a discussion yet of the intersectionality. That whole thing had not come out yet. That's like, but I'm thinking that our discussion really kind of began some of that dialogue, because we began to realize and talk about how women were put on the side, that women were being marginalized by our men in the movement, and that our input, our knowledge, our work was not getting the respect that it deserved. And so we started pushing that. And there were some heated debates, and the brothers would be mad at us and we would be mad at them. And we would argue like for hours about the need for women's participation, a movement that was anti-sexist, a movement that dealt with the uneven development in our organization, and what we should do about it. And I'm gonna say some of it was very painful to have those discussions. It was painful in the household sometimes. I counted myself somewhat lucky because my husband supported it, and yet he's sexist too. So sometimes, the thing is that sometimes, because he supported it, and he did, and he would voice it very clear, but when we come home, it was still, that division of labor that meant, I had to take up the most of the responsibility. And whereas he was able to go and do certain things, I had to stay back because we had children, right? So that was like an ongoing debate. And several of the sisters in our organization did some really radical things in their households. And it was a challenge for us to do that, right? Some of the men were not married because the women could not find time to get involved. They're busy running the house, or busy taking care of the kids. And so we began to challenge that, Now, honestly, this is the thing is, it's like, I guess it's like with anything, when you get used to a certain thing or you agree or believe. I mean, we had trouble with some of the women that didn't believe that we should challenge it, but we kept on and we kept on. And so we had to put like some real important things in place to make sure that we would get the development, that we would get the exposure, that we would be able to, express our political ideas and thoughts and help develop the organization too. One of them being that a woman always had to be in leadership, right? And the other one being is that if we were asked to speak for our organization, that it would either be a brother and a sister that would go, or we would alternate Brother go this time, the sister go next time. We would do it that way. And
Right.
it was almost like a rigid thing that we had to do to put in place in order to make sure that we dealt with it.
Mm.
And it was challenging because a lot of the women, because of the uneven development, did not like to speak, didn't want to speak. But we had to challenge, and I was one of them. I didn't necessarily want to speak,
Mm.
but I had to challenge myself to step up,
Mm.
to do more,
Mm.
and represent the women in our organization. And we did things like we did like a lot of study, and I wrote down here like we studied bell hooks, right?
Mm.
Even though her position as a Black feminist did not necessarily go along with ours, right?
Right.
But we studied her, and we kind of took her around like the Bible. I mean, we made the brothers study her, and we talked about it, and we challenged ourselves. And so out of that process, we began to see some of the issues in Black feminism. Coming back to your question,
Yeah.
in Black feminism that didn't necessarily apply to us as New African women. So we knew that we had to formulate our own ideas and look at how Black feminism saw the movement to end sexist oppression. It was different.
Mm.
Bell Hooks not a nationalist, so
Mhm.
her idea is to do a universal, working with all women, white women, and address theirs. Well, their issues were a little bit different than ours. Similar but not the same. They fighting for the right to work. We already working. You know, they're fighting for being able to have get paid for domestic work. Well, we ain't been getting that anyway. We're not staying at home and taking care of our kids. We're going to work.
Mhm.
So a
Mhm.
lot of the issues that, not saying that they weren't important issues for them, but they're different for us as a community of people, right?
Right.
So where we could unify was great, but we didn't think that feminism spoke to where we were looking to go, right?
Mhm.
So like I said, we started looking at other ways, theoretical frameworks in order to embrace our work. Um, and probably in a little of my naivete, I might have taken a stab at Black feminism, which it wasn't a uh, animosity,
Right.
but we realized that their theoretical framework was different than ours, and we
Right.
had to have something that was inclusive for us, that was inclusive of the community as a whole.
Mm.
We didn't want to attack our men, even though they had sexist issues. We
Mm.
didn't want to be the enemies of our men.
Mm.
We wanted to figure out how we can help them to address their thoughts about women that they've been raised with, that they've been doing their whole political life, and how we could address our feelings of sometimes sitting back and letting the men run amok,
Mhm.
right? So we wanted to do that to build community, to build family, and so that's what the difference was. That's what we saw about in terms of Black feminism. So we took on the term Africana womanism, which is a little different. It wasn't the Claire Hudson Weems. Is it Weems? Yeah, it wasn't the same as what she says as Africana womanism, but we kind
Mm.
of pretty much embraced what we saw Alice Walker speaking to when she first coined the term, right?
Mm.
That it was about being centered in ourselves as women and building community with our men. So
Right.
if that answers your question, I hope
Yes,
so.
it does 100%. And you mentioned the relentless debates that you would have with the men, and I was curious if um the New African Women's Organization, founded in 1980, kind of arose out of those debates, or can you talk about, since you are a co-founder, what the type of historical position that New African women took in terms of
Mhm.
organizing women's sectors within the larger movement?
Yeah, it actually did. It absolutely came out of those debates. It came out of our study.
Mm.
It came out of our, we studied separately from the brothers, but with the brothers too. And we really allowed them to challenge our ideas.
Mm.
We allowed them to challenge so that we could all grow, right? And you had to read it. You had to bring your thoughts, what you've been doing all this time. And like I said, one of the issues was that, well, we're much more developed than y'all. So we got to, so that was kind of like the debate. And we talked about why that was. And as we went through it, some of the brothers weren't in favor of us having a separate organization. They thought it was divisive,
Mm.
um, that it would take away from the organizing that we were doing in our communities. And so it was a struggle. One of the first things we did is we had a conference, and I remember it was in Birmingham, Alabama. Sister Synovia Muhammad, you might want to look her up. She worked in Birmingham. She's from New York, but she worked in Birmingham. And we put together this conference called Strong Women Coming. And it was a community conference. It wasn't supposed to be, a political conference at all, because we wanted to see what the women in the community saw and issues were. And in the best scenario, what we could do as an organization to address them. And so that's what we did. And we had like workshops, we had discussions, we had speakers, we had, and so we did that. I want to say we did at least one other, maybe two other ones, just trying to get a feel for community-based women, what they were looking for, what we could do politically, and what we could do to support. So that was kind of the development of it. With that organization, we were able to do some international work. We went to Cuba, and some roundtable discussions with the Federation of Cuban Women, and we exchanged ideas about the ways that they've had to deal with sexism, with the issues that they were having as women. And we did a nice, real nice exchange, roundtable exchange with them, and then besides that, talk about how we could support each other. So we took it to an international level, really at an early stage, because we thought it was very important that we talk to other women's movements, other women's struggles, other liberation struggles with the involvement of women, and to get guidance,
right?
And to talk about the issues that we were dealing with. And it was, the similarities were just like incredible, of course. And even though some of the issues, like particularly in Cuba, there were some different issues that they were having to deal with, being a revolutionary country. But these women have been involved in the struggle. They have been involved in the streets. They have been involved in the armies. But they were still dealing with sexism. They had some issues such as because tourism had come back into Cuba, and so they were having issues with prostitution and that kind of thing, women's image, and how men viewed them, and those kinds of issues, even though they're a revolutionary country. So those were things that really helped us, to develop ourselves, and at the same time make some international solidarity commitments. So.
Thank you for that. And that kind of correlates to the question I was going to ask later, but to transition a little, because you are a co-founder of the New African Peoples Organization, which was founded in 1984, I was wondering if you could talk about what function the New African Peoples Organization sought to fulfill within the larger New African independence movement.
Okay, so NAPO was New African Peoples Organization is a came together as from different groupings, right? All of those who agreed with the idea of New African liberation, claim to the 5 states in the Black Belt, that Black people are a nation within a nation. And so there were several groups, Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, I think you mentioned them in your presentation. There was the African People's Party, which we were part of. There was a Freedom Fighters organization in New York. And we had kind of done, off and on did work with all of those different groupings, right? Some people want to, I've heard it said that NAPO was a offshoot or break off from the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. And only in the sense, not an offshoot at all, but only in the sense that two of our founding leadership, Chokwe Lumumba and Ahmed Obafemi, at one point served as officers in the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. And they never ever, disclaimed their membership, because we all basically feel that we are a part of the government, but not necessarily the part that was an organization, right? So they never denounced their membership or anything or the politics of the PG, but there was a different level of activism that we were searching for, that we wanted.
Mhm.
And so NAPA was, like I said, a grouping of people that wanted to become like a, for lack of a better word, a cadre organization that would train, uh, create leadership, um, that would address and look at nationally and internationally the issues that African people were experiencing here in the United States, and see what work we could do for that. So that was what was important at that point. I know I'm gonna kind of jump into your
Yes,
other question
please.
about
Yeah,
the
please.
Malcolm X grassroots movement,
Yeah.
because as we built with New African Peoples Organization, we realized that everybody wasn't going to be ready for this, because it's a commitment, it's a whole, it's a change in lifestyle, so to speak. Like if you want to smoke weed or you want to, what I won't, I should take that. Let me take that out. But anyway, not that's just one of the things. Maybe you don't want to make a commitment that way,
Right.
but you do want to do work
Mm.
in the community, and you do see work that needs to be done in the community. And so the Malcolm X grassroots movement was found to go into that community organizing
Right.
and to become involved in that, not just creating organization, but mostly trying to fit in with the other organizations that were already doing the work.
Mm.
And it was considered an organization because it could pull in people who didn't necessarily want to be the cadre,
Mm.
but wanted to do work
Mm-hmm.
and could identify with our principles. And that's what we were looking for. If you could identify with the principles, and please don't ask me to quote them because I haven't done it in a long time.
No, I won't.
The only one I really could probably talk to, well, if I had to, I'd be hard pressed. I couldn't word it. Would be the sixth principle, but I say that because that's what we were looking for.
Right.
And then you'd be surprised. I'm not really surprised. I wasn't surprised because I said most people want to do something about their situation. Most people are looking for something that there's some way they can work, some place that they can shelter,
Right.
and then they can learn from on how to do this work.
Mm.
So a lot of the stuff that came up with Black Lives Matter, we were already doing that kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
when Black Lives Matter started doing it, we worked with Black Lives Matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
The work that they did, great. We got in, we fit in, we did some work, we did some organizing, made some solidarities with some of the leadership,
Mm.
and as well as other organizations. So yeah, so that was the idea behind the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And I'm trying to think of because Chokwe Lumumba, our initial founder, wrote a whole piece about why we needed that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's addressed every issue, as you see, as we go forward. Even dealing with this crazy administration right now,
Mm-hmm.
what we need to be doing at this point, how
Mm-hmm.
we need to be building solidarity, how we need to be building movements within our community that will help sustain us.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, the local chapter here is involved in anything that really comes up that's about us, we're involved in,
Yeah.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, um, and we're going to their meetings. We're putting forth whatever we can to support, to connect, not trying to take it over, because we have our own organization for that, right? We have our own organization to do the way we want to do it, but making some connections so that we can be supportive of the movements that are happening that are just like organic to our people,
Mm.
right? They're organic. People are going to resist. So that's what we do, and that's what the Malcolm X grassroots movement is for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned this previously, but about the internationalism of the New African People's Organization, and one could argue just the New African independence movement in general. Um, you know, NAPA was rooted in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist politics, as you all identified with the national liberation struggles in Africa and in the U.S. with Native Americans, Chicano, Mexicano, Puerto Ricans. So you discussed how New African women in particular were connecting with Cuban women and aligning and discussing the problems that women face. So I was curious, were there any other national liberation movements that the women were in contact with, discussing, organizing with? And just in general, what do you recall of who NAPA organized with in terms of internationalist global organizing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Puerto Rican Solidarity Party, PSP. but it was a Puerto Rican solidarity. I don't know, I can't think of the term, but anyway, we did a lot of work with the Puerto Ricans, right? Um, and we had like several like international conferences here within the states where we had these movements represented. All the movements that we basically made connection with agreed that they had a right to independence. You know, Puerto Rico being one. I want to call on the name of Dilcy Pagan, who is a Puerto Rican freedom fighter and served a long time in prison and had a connection with another freedom fighter, very strong connection, Nahanda Abiadoun. And she had exile in Cuba, and Dilcy Pagan, once she was released, she went to see her. Mm-hmm. And so I say that we did a lot of solidarity work with the Puerto Ricans. We've done a lot of solidarity work with the Latinx community, the Native community, and one of the struggles that we as an organization would almost inevitably have with somebody like, how can you claim that you have the right to 5 states on the native land? So we actually worked in solidarity with the Native peoples, and we had an agreement, and it's their agreement to give or not give. And certainly, if they ever said, "Nah, y'all can't have that," we'd have to honor that because this is their land, and we respect that and we honor that, right? But so we never ever tried to say, that whole debate about, well, they don't have enough people to fill this land anyway. It's not ours to take. Just like it wasn't the colonialists, the settlers, to come in and say, "Oh, we're just going to take this for ourselves." It's not theirs to take, So we certainly agree with that. And in solidarity with the Native peoples, we would always, put forth what our requests were for. And as long as they said it was okay, that we're going to move forward. Because we're not trying to be colonialists. We're not trying to be settlers.
Right.
And we definitely respect that this is the indigenous people's land. And they were here before we got here, and even though we came in, the most unscrupulous, most horrible conditions ever in the Maafa, it's still not our right to take anybody's land.
Thank you. I agree. That has been something that I've come across doing research, the question of the land, of course, in terms of Native Americans' claims. And something that I noted in my research, though, is that New Africans, as you just demonstrated, consistently say that Native Americans' claims to the land precede ours. So that recognition that, as you've already said, they were here before. And that kind of relates to my next question, which is about the concept of settler colonialism and how this is like a central understanding the United States as a settler colonial project is central to New Africans' understanding of their connection to the land, as you just demonstrated. So I was curious if you could talk about how understanding the United States as a settler colony informs New Africans' demand for nationhood in the U.S., which you kind of already talked about, so I'm not sure if there's much more you'd want to add.
I wrote this in my notes because it was came up not too long ago for me in a class where we were talking about what is a nation, who has a right, what makes them a nation. And so our initial idea, or as from what I understand, because it precedes me too, is that the claim for 5 states in the Black Belt comes from the idea that we at that time represented 10% of the population. And so we had the right to ask for 10%, and so we would claim those 5 states. Those 5 states are the ones that we had an historical connection with, that we had lived for a long time, worked for a long time. And it was an agreed upon place where most of our people were. Now, of course, that's kind of changed a little bit. And then the whole question of, the agriculture as opposed to the urban environment, some of that has changed because even though some of those areas that were particularly agricultural are no longer that, so a lot of that has changed, and it's still it'll still be developed. We'll still be working it, as we are trying to get our independence, right? Trying to get our independence. And so what it will look like might change. but the concept is going to be the same. You
Right.
know, white people, the settler colonies, they're illegal. They came in and took some land that wasn't theirs.
Mm.
Then they went and took us to kind of try to build this land. They took us, we weren't there. They made profits on us. And so we've been struggling for so many years trying to get our liberation. So that would be how I would address. That's how I would see it.
Mm.
Like I said, it's not necessarily going to look the way we might write it down theoretically, because it really is what we are able to get and where we are able to secure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
And we're going back to talking about New African Women's organizing. The MXGM has a New African Women's Task Force, which you are a member of. So I was curious, if you could talk about the function of the NAWTF. And I also had a question doing research on MXGM. Is the NAWTF, or is the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee, an extension of the work of NAWTF? Because I know that they do a lot of important political education
mhm.
for the public, which I've been a beneficiary of learning from. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be quite honest. I don't exactly know. I'm glad
Okay.
you asked me that question because I have not been like actively involved in
Right.
like when we have conferences, ideological conferences and things like that. Because I've kind of been away for like about a year or more, maybe two, almost two now. But anyway, in terms of that level of organizing, but from what I understand, that committee is very important. It advises
Mhm.
the larger organization about issues that are pertinent to gender, sexism, heterosexism, um, and so there was a lot of discussion. I mean, you could probably imagine, maybe not because you're young, but the conversations and struggles around gender nonconformity,
Mhm.
around heterosexism, support for LGBTQ. That was like a huge issue for a number of years within the organization,
Mhm.
um, and challenging conversation because at the time of our founding, it wasn't as broad as it is now for sure,
Mhm.
right? And so as more young people were drawn to our organization, they began to challenge it, rightfully so. But then you got the old heads and the new heads. And so I like the fact really that our organization agreed that this is what we should do.
Mhm.
When some people in their heart of hearts say, "Oh no, that ain't right, that ain't right," but they agree that we should deal with it, right?
Right.
Because we got people who are just like, "No, that's just not of God" in our organization, right?
Mhm.
And it's going to make us look bad in the community. We've had people who left our organization because they just could not get with that principle and that idea and that struggle and didn't want to have it. They didn't think we should have it. Don't do that. But so I'm saying that to say that that particular committee is important because as many are struggling with that idea internally, we can also begin to look at what is happening to us, people of African descent, and the people who are LGBTQ, and how those
Mhm.
things merge, and what we need to do. We got to fight oppression everywhere. We do, and so whether or not you agree with it for whatever reason, morally, whatever it is that keeps you uncomfortable with it. Like I said, I'm proud of my organization that it is gone on and taken it and is attacking it from within and without.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And going back to the New African Women's Task Force, can you talk about how that formed? And I guess we might be able to guess kind of the reason why in terms of furthering the fight against sexism within the organization. But if you could just speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely is the reason why it formed. As we began to have those struggles, we realized that we needed a organization that was a part of but separate. And so, um, we could not allow the male energy to decide who our leadership would be. Um, We made sure that we had someone that was in the leadership body at all times. That was a principle. I think it had to be at least two at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we made sure that that was enforced. We made sure that women went out to speak on behalf of the organization and the New African Women's Task Force,
Mm-hmm.
and that when men spoke, they had to speak to sexist oppression as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was a phenomenal success for us, to get them to agree that no matter what the conversation they were having in solidarity with another movement and whatever we're talking about, that at some point they're going to talk about the struggle to end sexist oppression.
Right.
Like I said, that was just like a phenomenal success for us, one that we still stand on.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being, sometimes you have to step away, even though, like I said at the beginning, our struggle is not necessarily against our men,
Mm-hmm.
but we got to struggle with them too. We got to
Right.
struggle with them because of their sexist ideas. And sometimes you have to step away. Now, we had a long struggle about that as well, about us, the need for a separate women's organization, or for them. Many of the men thought that that was divisive. Many of the women thought it too.
Mm-hmm.
And we were, a small organization. So do we want to divide the energy? But yes, we did. We needed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We needed to divide that energy. Didn't mean that we were moving away from anything that we believed politically, but it was necessary for us to come up with our own theoretical framework, our own principles, our own work, and to make sure that that was done inside of our broader organization. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And my final question for you is about kind of what you see as you mentioned earlier, the organizational task of African people today in terms of fighting against this current administration, but also the future, because we know that
Mm-hmm.
fascism is becoming more entrenched in the US. Not that it hasn't ever been before necessarily. So, the Malcolm X crisis movement is still active today in 8 cities: Oakland, Chicago, Jackson, Detroit, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York, proving that the New African Independence movement has yet to cease. So, in our current moment of the further entrenchment of fascism in the U.S., what do you see as the role of the Malcolm X crisis movement in fulfilling like a resistance to the current political moment and, further in the future?
Yeah, that's a challenge. It's not a challenging question, but it's an important question. Let's say that it's an important question, because we as an organization have taken up the challenge to continue to raise the fascism that is existing and is developing, which we've been talking about for years,
Mm.
but now people are finally starting to see it in real life, right?
Right.
And so, as challenging as it is because of the conditions that we're living under, right? We still are going to move forward with that, and organizations that are anti-fascist and dealing with that as well. I think our work is even more critical today than it was before, even though it always has been. I I envision Dr. Matula Shakur just really just going off, and telling us what we need to do and what we got to be doing and how this is so important. And did you know about this organization? Did you know about this? And just pushing forward in attacking fascism where we see it, right? And not being afraid to stand up, not not afraid to put truth to power, as they say. Um, I was just reflecting on a conversation I had with a colleague, or actually, a colleague, um, about I'm just looking at, like, at NCBS, for instance. That's one of the things, about how they're trying to shut down all these departments, and that's an act that we got to attack, because we as a people fought too hard to get this curriculum, right? People shut down schools, people lost their careers, people went to jail. It's been years, but people, have struggled a lot to have this happen so that our people will know about us. So they will know about us. So that's an act to me,
Mm-hmm.
that we are being faced with. On these other things, we could probably make a whole laundry list of all of it because it's a lot,
Right.
And so where we can, we are going to attack it. We are
Mm-hmm.
going to attack it, and
Mm-hmm.
without fear, and because I think our people need to see us. They need to see somebody standing up. You hear these things where people say, well, what the leadership not doing this, the leadership not doing it. Well, the leadership is, what leadership you talking about?
Right.
Who are you looking for? Are you looking for these big name leaders, or are you looking for people who are leaders in our community and are looking up and trying to help our people to deal with what's getting ready to happen or what is happening and
Hmm.
has been happening with us, right? So that's where we are. That's our job. We got to stay on the task at all times because I don't think it's all is not out yet because
Right.
every day is something else, right?
Right.
So those are the kind of things that we have to do. We have to do as the New African Peoples Organization, the Malcolm X grassroots movement on a broader level, and looking at how these issues will affect women um, through the New African Task Force,
Hmm.
the African Task Force.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again. You've given me so much that would have been impossible to learn through like primary sources or just reading newspapers. So I'm seriously really grateful to you and thank you so much. And